Okay, so one of the things I kind of want to talk about today is, while the textbook does a pretty good job of explaining what drove the United States to enter the war and the antipathy of the United States towards fascism, the book does a very poor job of explaining what fascism is. Now, partially because we tend to think of fascism as a European thing. So for those of you who ever take a Western Civ or AP European history, you might have a better grasp of fascism in their second semester course. And so one of the things that I kind of want to get into is to give you a firm understanding of fascism, because we kind of bandy the term about without really appreciating what it is. In our political culture, you've actually seen a lot of people accusing the other guy of being a fascist. And so it begs the question, what is fascism? Now, y'all have been informed of various things that we associate with fascism, but we haven't really gotten into what it is. So today we're going to sort of talk about the rise of fascism in 1930s Europe. Fascism as a political ideology, most people have it starting in Italy. Now I want to talk to you about the countries we associate with fascism. Italy is the first one. Who else were adversaries of the United States during the Second World War? Germany. Second World War. Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer exists. Japan. And I'm going to put Japan way over here. The reason I'm going to put Japan way over here is also Italy and Germany are relatively proximately close on the European continent, and Japan is literally half a world away. But that's not the only reason I got Japan way over there. Japan doesn't actually qualify as a fascist state. Fascism, Japan already had an imperial tradition of the deified emperor. So it's not like in Europe where you have a leader coming to power who is now deified by the people as a result of the media complex. In Japan, the emperor was already seen as divine. You get the idea. And so part of defining fascism depends on defining the relationship of the church and the state to its people. Now, there's one other fascist country that I did not put up there yet, but I'm going to, because that fascist country was not an enemy of the United States, did not fight the United States in World War II, but was actually a fascist country from the early 20th century until the 1970s, and was an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union. Spain. So when I'm talking, and so the idea that the United States went to war to stamp out fascism is not entirely true. We had a coexistence with certain types of fascism into the 1970s. By the way, how did fascism finally end in Spain? Does anyone know? When their leader finally died, when Franco died of natural causes. So this was not simply about fascism. So a couple of things. We're going to start with Italy, then we're going to get to Germany, then we're going to get to Spain. And so when I talk about Japan, I don't think of Japan as fascist. They're an ally of the fascists of Europe, but they are not themselves fascist. Okay? So, fascism is a society, typically some of the characteristics of a fascist state are one-party rule, a highly charismatic leader, where the government exerts control over media, industry, it is tied to a nationalist philosophy as opposed to a globalist philosophy. And also it uses the military, it relies on militarism to unite the people, and it uses the military to enforce its ends, usually violently. 1932, one-party rule, a highly charismatic leader that controlled media and the industry and relied on nationalism in 1932. And a man stayed in power until he was carried out. Who was elected president in 1932? FDR. Now, you didn't have FDR using goons to go shoot Republicans when they got out of line, so maybe we can think of this as a polite form of fascism. Maybe fascism light? I don't know. I don't know if the bill actually fits, but you do see some elements of the shoe wrapping around the toes, don't you? But I'll get to that in a moment. So let's see how we get to Il Duce in Italy and Der Führer in Germany. Both Italy and Germany actually have a couple of things in common, which in some ways helps explain the rise of fascism. Italy and Germany are both young states of old nations. Let me say that again. Italy and Germany are young states of old nations. What do I mean by young states of old nations? What do I mean by an old nation? What is a nation? People who combine a language, a culture, and a sense of history. So in many ways we would actually think of a nation less as a government and more as an ethnicity. So we have language, culture, and a sense of history. Now let's go to Italy for a moment. If I am Italian and I am talking about Italy as an old nation, if I'm Italian, what is my history? Rome. The Roman Empire. So if I'm talking about Italy, you have the historical tradition of the Roman Empire, but how do we get from the Roman Empire to the boot-shaped country of Italy? There's a lot of steps that go on. So in the case of Italy, you first have the period of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire eventually falls to the Goths. So then you have the Gothic occupation. You have the Goths, which I know many of you are now picturing very pale-faced people with black hair dye. Listening to also, or is the term emo now? I don't know. So no, these were not emo kids occupying Rome. These were very bearded German people. And after the Goths, you have a feudal period. Now, after the feudal period, what are the things that Italy is most famous for? Well, yes. Okay. In film, it's not just the pizza. When you're talking about Romeo and Juliet, this was in a period of warring city-states. So you have the Renaissance. And actually, it's kind of interesting. So you have the fall of the city, and then you have a period, actually, of incessant warfare. When I talk about a period of incessant warfare, you're talking through the 14th century. So you have the Renaissance, where you have the different city-states. And so when you travel to Italy today, you visit some of the remnants of these city-states. What are the old Italian city-states that we might be familiar with? Rome was the papal state, but you have Milan, you have Venice, you have Florence, you have Naples, Turin. You have all of these different city-states, and these city-states were actually at war with one another, struggling for supremacy. And one of the greatest impediments to actually the unification of Italy was the papacy itself. Nowadays, you think of the papacy as this nice little man who's in a little box called Vatican City. In the into the 1500s and the 1600s. The Pope was a prince of a territory. It was called the Papal States, and he had designs to exert his influence over all of Italy. By the way, kind of ironic, and this is not an apology for Mussolini, who puts the Pope in the box of Vatican City? Mussolini does. The separation of Vatican City from the rest of Italian politics is a result of fascist domination of Italy in the early 20th century. So now the Holy See being free from worldly affairs, you can kind of thank Mussolini for that, but he won't hear you. All right, so you have, after a period of war where some of these city-states, they allied themselves with France, they allied themselves with other city-states, they used papal money, they used all sorts of fun stuff. In the 1559 to 1796, Italy was dominated by the Habsburgs. So you had the Austrian Habsburgs, and then you also had the Spanish Habsburgs. So they were occupied by foreign princes. By the way, who kind of starts making his way to power in Europe in the 1790s into the early 19th century? Short little man running the assault columns. So you have Napoleon, then you have the Napoleonic era. By the way, where was Napoleon from? No. Sardinia. Funny thing about Sardinia. Sardinia is politically French, but ethnically Italian. So you have Sicily, then you have Sardinia, and it's right next to their southern coast, the French southern coast. So it was ethnically Italian, but politically French. Kind of interesting that a person who was ethnically Italian rises to power in the French officer corps and becomes the French dictator, although not actually that interesting because Hitler was Austrian but ran a German empire. And Stalin, I'm trying to remember if he was Belarusian or Ukrainian. Or Georgian. I'm trying to remember. He wasn't ethnically Russian. Kind of interesting. So, you have the Napoleonic era. By the way, what happens to Napoleon? Battle of Waterloo, he's defeated. And he is exiled. And what happens, and this event actually coincides with the creation of modern Germany, you have the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is where the existing European powers who defeated Napoleon divvy up Europe into various states. Okay? And that's in 1815. 1815 is the beginning of the Italian unification movement. So you had these disparate city-states who now are trying to forge a common identity. One of the first writers of this modern unification movement is Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini is the father of modern nationalism. I quote his concept extensively. And so he had this idea. Here he has the people who are linguistically, historically Italian, but they also see themselves politically as Manchu, as Turinian, as Roman, as Venetian, as Neapolitan. And so there is this idea, and Mazzini actually writes of a great prophecy that there will be one who comes who brings the kingdoms of Italy together. Now, 1861, you have the creation of the modern Italian state. I'll get to Germany in just a moment. 1861 is the beginning of what they call Liberal Italy. Liberal Italy is the first united Italy. That goes from 1861 to 1922. Now, 1861, you have a constitutional monarchy in what is called Liberal Italy. So they have some aspects of a representative government. They also have a king. I want to say 1915 or 1916 to 1917. Who's at war from 1914 to 1917? World War I. Italy's late to the game, but they ally themselves with the Allied powers. You may recall in one of the 14 points was that the Germans would leave northern Italy. So, Italy fights against Germany in World War I. Their units are for the most part defeated. Other than definition of their territory in Lombardy, what did the Italians get out of the blood loss and the indignities of World War I? Nothing. They get no material benefit from the war. They do have colonies in Somalia and Eritrea, but those were never contested because, again, if you look at the colonial map of Africa, the territories near Somalia and Eritrea are Ethiopia, which had been independent forever, and Egypt. Who controls Egypt and Sudan? England. Yes, the British. And so they gain no territorial advantage in Africa. They gain no financial advantage because Germany's paying reparations to England and France. So for them, was World War I a win? No. So in the global depression that occurs after World War I, really Europe is kind of the leading edge and the US is the trailing edge, and it hits both people just as hard. Now, 1922 is a moment of crisis. You have an economic downturn. And what often happens when you have an economic downturn? Well, not just that. There's one thing that everyone sort of, that a lot of people forget. You have an economic downturn, and you have, especially after 1917, what political philosophy becomes both frightening and dangerous that arises out of Russia in 1917? Communism. So you have communists and socialists advocating for the takeover of industries, and so you have revolutionary communists on the march in Italy. Now, a couple of things. What's scary about communism if you're a traditional Italian?
No state religion.
No religion at all. If you're Italian, what are you? You are a staunch Roman Catholic. And Catholicism, I will say this, Christianity may have some socialist tendencies, but for the most part, you still have respect for private property. Thou shalt not steal. Whereas, Communist Manifesto, the bourgeois got it badly, we the oppressed people, we need to take it away from them. And so, 1922 is a moment of crisis. You're King Emmanuel, and you have a weak government that's been decimated by the war, that has had poor income taxes. So you have King Emmanuel in 1922. He has to make a choice between the socialists and the fascists. You're between the rock and the hard place, between the one guy who's talking about the government taking over everything and the other guy who's talking about safety and peace. So you're King Emmanuel. You have to choose between the socialists and the fascists. Which one do you choose? He chooses the fascists. Because here's the thing. If I'm King Emmanuel, I also recognize one thing. What did the socialists do to the king in Russia? And so one of the things that a lot of people forget is that fascism is not simply a predatory philosophy. A lot of people ran to fascism because the communists scared the heck out of them. Somebody speaking, self-avowed socialist, and people ran to the other guy. Too soon for that joke? All right. All right, so 1922, Mussolini is first the Prime Minister of Italy and then assumes the title of Il Duce, which I know sounds like the shower for those of you who speak Spanish, but Il Duce, Duke, leader in Italian. There are certain words that get lost from Italian to Spanish. I'm very sorry about that. We couldn't keep the Roman Empire together. We didn't have radio. So that was fun. So that's how it got started in Italy. Kind of a funny story. Shortly after the war, Mussolini was a socialist writer originally, But rather than embracing the global socialist vision embraced by the communists, he embraced a type of national socialism. Now, to explain National Socialism in a nutshell, it is that the idea that the government should intervene in what is best for its people, and so it's not laissez-faire economics the way we would have in our society. But for the most part, the state leaves certain things alone. Now let's get to Germany. Everybody good on Italy? Yes? Okay. And then we'll get to Spain. So Germany, kind of similar in a way. You have Germany is an old nation, but a young state. When was the first empire of Germany? You all took world history. You had time to forget it. Was ist die Ersten Reich? What is the first empire? It was the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, nor was it much of an empire. So you have the Holy Roman Empire, which united the Germanies. And I use the term Germanies. When I use the term Germanies, what am I saying? Well, they weren't warring states when they were under the empire, but the German-speaking states, of which there were several. And even, how many of y'all went to Germany? I know we had a student group that went to Germany last year. Were any of you among them? Okay, how many of you have been to Germany in complete generality? I know some of you have traveled. None of you? Okay. So, in France, you don't have states, you have provinces. It means the conquered place. But auf Deutsch, you have Staaten. They still call them states, as a homage to their previous independence. So you have the breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire. Then, once again, very similar to Italy, you have a period of war between the German-speaking states. That comes to an end in 1876. 1876, you have the Franco-Prussian War. So, in the period of the warring states, there rose a hegemonic power among the Germanies. This was the state of Prussia, P-R-U-S-S-I-A, or in German as it is pronounced, Preußen. Preußen is Berlin and the area around it. Okay. Preußen, through force of arms, led by a series of military heroes, one of which was Frederick the Great, who literally fought a war with France and Russia at the same time, and won. Well, actually, it works really well in the 18th century because your enemies don't communicate with each other. You take your whole army, throw it at one guy on one frontier, trucks him across your own territory, and throw him at the other guy at the other frontier. Now, the other thing about the Prussians, and there is a reason why the Prussians are the dominant state in Germany. And it is the reason why Prussian hegemony unites the Germanies in the Franco-Prussian War. This is a highly militarized state. So most states create an army for its own protection. This army created a state for its own furtherance. They were called the Spartans of Europe. Let me describe to you life in Prussian society. Y'all are in graded schools right now. That is a Prussian institution in origin. Why do you put kids in school if you're a highly militaristic state? First you unite them. You institute them into your bureaucracy. You are in school for... Is that us? No. Okay. You take people out of the hinterland, you put them in schools, you teach them how to read, write, do math in standard German, and you teach them how to march. After being in school, 10 or 11 or 12 years, you're about 18 years old. And so, auf die Schule, aus die Wehrmacht. From the school to the army. You would be in the army. Every able-bodied man would be in the army for a period of 6 years. And why would you be in the army for a period of 6 years? Because, well, congratulations, you got to get them out of the... You got to make your army somehow, and when's the best age for people to start fighting? 18 to 24. After being in the army for 6 years, you would be moved to the Freikorps. The Freikorps was their military reserve. There you would stay until you were 40 or until you were dead. We don't have anything like that, do we? Now, what's the effect? They have a very large, swollen army, so their education apparatus serves their army. Their industrial complex serves their army. When they set up rail lines, by the way, they had the coal to do it and the iron. The military ran their rail stations. So here this highly militarized society turns itself loose, attacks the French, takes over the Alsace-Lorraine. What's the next major conflict in Europe after 1876? 1914 to 1918. What happens? And who wins? Not Germany. Germany loses the First World War. And what were some of the consequences of that loss? Reparations, that's one. And they were demilitarized. Now think about this for a moment. You have no tax money and you have 18 to 24-year-olds with no job, and they're used to marching in formations because that's what their fathers had done and their fathers' fathers. And so you have the throng of angry men used to marching in formation, used to marching to the beat of the Kaiser's drum. And the Allies took that away. And so they found a new drummer boy. Adolf Hitler. Now, kind of interesting. Now, think about this also. When you demilitarize a country, what is a nation state? What is a state? What is the first business of statecraft? Warfare and physical violence. If you take away its army, you take away the ability of a nation state not only to wage foreign war, but also to keep its population in check. So before the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany, you had perennial socialist uprisings. You had Hitler trying to have a coup in Bavaria. He was arrested. He writes Mein Kampf while he's in prison. But eventually, the National Socialist Party wins an electoral majority in the Reichstag. The most frightening thing you need to keep and bear in mind is that the fascists came to power by election. But again, people chose fascism because what was the alternative? The alternative was not status quo. The alternative was not peaceable coexistence. The alternative was a type of predatory socialism that people could not live with. So in each case, you have weak executives on the part of King Emmanuel, weak executive on the part of President Hindenburg, and you have the rise of the strong cults of personality, and also you have the political triangulation as the fascists put themselves as the sane alternative to communism. I want you to think about that for a moment. There are plenty of people who actively made the choice for fascism because the alternatives were far more terrifying. And so here you have Hitler's vision where he actually goes to the idea, he actually says of the Germans, we are the barbarians, referencing back to the barbarian Germans who overthrew the great Roman Empire. He talks about it in terms of an apocalyptic vision of a 1,000-year Reich. And then there's Spain. Now, what happened to Spain in 1898? What was the main event of 1898? The main event of 1898 was the sinking of the USS Maine. 1898, you have the Spanish-American War. What happened to the Empire of Spain in the Spanish-American War? It lost Right. Now, Spain had been a declining power going back to Mexico's revolt from Spain in 1821. But the final nail in the coffin of the Spanish Empire was the Spanish-American War. And so in many ways we can kind of thank the United States for fascism in Spain. So, into the 20th century, you have once again a conflict between socialists being funded by... Oh, by the way, so we're talking Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Let me do that. So, 1936 to 1939, you have the Spanish Civil War. In Germany and in Italy, fascism prevailed over what political ideology? Communism and socialism. The Spanish Civil War was a fight between the Spanish Republic, that was the socialists, and traditional elements of their military. Some of them were actually based in northern Africa. It was a fight between the socialists and the fascists. That's 1936 to 1939. Now, here's the thing I want you to think about. Now, the Germans and the Italians actually put troops, they actually put material, they actually sent money. They supported the fascists in the war against the socialists. And who do you think gave money to the socialists and gave arms and gave aid? Russia, and along with socialists in the United States and patriots in the United States, there were Americans in the Spanish-American War fighting each other. There were Britons in the Spanish-American War jumping in as well. In the Spanish Civil War, fighting each other. You get the idea. This was the microcosm of a conflict between communism and fascism, and the rest of the United States is looking at that and saying what? The standard American politicos are looking at that and saying what? If I got two political ideologies that I don't like and they're both killing each other, do I really want to get into that mess? So America decided to stay out of the Spanish Civil War. Eventually the fascists will prevail. They're led by Francisco Federico Franco, who ruled Spain until like 1972, 1976. He hung in there. Great sunglasses on that guy, by the way. Anyway. So, 1936 to 1939, you have Spanish Civil War, the fascists prevail. Moving on. The Anschluss and the Munich Pact. So, let me get to the Anschluss, and then we'll get to Munich, and then we'll get to the invasion of Poland. And I think that would probably be the best place to stop. 12:50? That's about right. Okay. Okay, do we have all this? Yes? Okay. So, a couple of things that's kind of interesting about Germany and the particulars of the Anschluss. Now, if you think about it, in and of itself, had a couple other things I wanted to tell you. So, kind of a side note, but kind of fun and interesting. First use of airborne incendiaries was when the Italians actually started dropping it on resistance fighters in Somalia. Great way to humiliate people. They were also used in the Spanish Civil War. They were deployed by the Germans. But anyway, so let me talk to you about the Anschluss, and then we'll get to Munich, and then we'll get to Poland. Okay. I kind of, not until they signed the alliance. In other words, Japan isn't really a fascist country. They had, even after, when they had become industrialized, you do have a centralized government exerting itself. I mean, they had already gone through that centralized process after the era of the samurai had ended. And so the imperial worship had always been a thing. And so you don't really have a takeover of the government the way you had in Germany. The existing government was already there. Now, if I actually look at Japanese expansion, We can talk about the Sino-Japanese War, which was a war between China and Japan, by the way, over Manchuria. That illustrated some of the weaknesses of Japan and actually, or not of Japan, of China, and actually helps precipitate the open door notes. Okay, so I'm going to reference back to the open door notes. A lot of that had to do with Sino-Japanese War. And then what happened in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905? The Russians got owned, and that actually in many ways precipitated Germany. And again, we talked about this in our discussion of World War I. The Russo-Japanese War, the summary trouncing of the Russians in 1905 kind of helped start the process of getting the ball rolling for World War I. And so, again, you're not having a change in government. Here you simply have Japan becomes industrialized largely as a result of British and American influence, and it becomes an expansive state expanding beyond the island onto Manchuria, onto the Koreas, and starts exerting its will there. And so here we can really look at Japanese expansion not as anything novel, but rather as a continuation of a trend. Now what's interesting is the novelty really is the Sino-Japanese War, because previously Japan had sequestered itself from the rest of Asia. But you don't have a massive government change, you just have the centralization of its bureaucracy. Okay, the Anschluss. So, to understand the Anschluss, we need to kind of go back to 1876. So 1876, you have the creation of the German Empire. Modern Germany. You have Germany. By the way, is Germany the only country in the world where they speak German? No. What's the country next to Germany? What's the German-speaking country next to Germany? Used to be part of a Hungarian empire. Austria. Now, for those of you who don't speak German, Austria is an English word. It's not what they call themselves in Austria. For those of you who don't speak German, the word is Österreich, which sounds like ostrich, but that's not what it is. Eastern Reich Empire. Austria was a separate empire from the Deutsches Reich. Okay? What's the other German-speaking country? There are 3 German-speaking countries today.
Germany.
We already talked about them. Starts with an S. Lots of watches and army knives you get from there. Switzerland, aus der Schweiz. Wait, who here is in German? Or did? Okay, so if I'm screwing up the pronunciation, you should tell me.
Nope, do it better than I did.
Alright. Aber etwas nicht unbedingt macht sie stärker, yeah? Okay. Now, Austria, Hitler's hometown. The Anschluss, Germany annexes Austria. Actually, it's not an annexation, it is a plebiscite. For those of you who don't know what a plebiscite is a popular uprising. So basically, the people in Austria, and some would say as a matter of plants, others would say as a matter of legitimate political, cultural affinity, decided since Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were allies in World War I, they shared cultural ties, they share the Führer, they share a language, they share some aspect of the sense of history. Austria, by virtue of a popular uprising, joins the German Empire. Switzerland does not. By the way, if you go to Switzerland today, you better be trilingual, because what are the 3 languages you need to know to get around in Switzerland? German, Italian, and French. Because Switzerland is where all 3 of them meet, and Switzerland prides itself on its independence. And it has one very interesting way of maintaining its independence in the midst of many and oppressive empires. How do you maintain your independence from a highly militaristic German state? Not a bigger one. You have a better one. So in Switzerland, remember the Prussians were militaristic, the Swiss were more so. In Switzerland, to this very day, from the time you come of age to the time you are 65, you are in the military, you are in the ready reserve of the Swiss Army.
Oh, really?
You go to boot camp, You get a SIG 5.56, and you get to take it home with you along with 50 rounds of ammunition. Now, at the time, it was a different weapon, but yes, every Swiss man had a bolt-action long gun that the Germans knew if they invaded Switzerland, they were going to have a bad time. So, the Swiss stayed neutral, but it was an armed neutrality. Okay, I will have to get to the conquest of Poland later.